Today, we're going to compare 3 different ways of making the same React Native app to appreciate their advantages, disadvantages, and performance. We're going to be comparing vanilla React Native, Hermes and Expo. In addition, we're going to measure how does adding a third-party library to our project called React Native Paper can impact the app startup time and the app size. First of all, a couple of quick notes. These tests are going to be developed on my phone, which is a Samsung Galaxy Note 3, which was released in the year 2013. So I know that this is an 8-year-old phone, but it is the only Android that I have, so I will try to do my best to make this video. Moreover, I don't have a MacBook, so unfortunately I won't be able to test these apps on an iPhone. These and all the following tests were made using the release build of each app. Some of you commented on the previous video that there was an option to disable the splash screen on React Native to improve the app startup time, so I decided to research that on the favorite place of every programmer, Stack Overflow. But unfortunately, I think that the splash screen cannot be disabled on React Native since it is required to show while the app loads. So this video is a continuation of my previous video in which I made a similar experiment trying to compare React Native, Flutter and Native, so check it out if you're interested on that. I'm making this video inspired by a Fireship's video in which essentially he makes a comparison of different web frameworks using a to-do list, so I thought it would be cool to apply this idea to mobile as well. Besides that, I am making the to-do app design inspired by a tech leads video, so credits for all these great people. So now, let's get started. First, I tried vanilla React Native, which essentially is the most basic and simple way to write a React Native app. At first, it seemed very intimidating for me since most of the tutorials on YouTube from which I learned React Native were teaching people to use Expo, since it is the easiest and fastest way to set things up. So I had to make a lot of weird steps to get vanilla React Native going. Like, I remember that I had to install Chocolately, Java version 8 I think, then I had to modify some random hidden Windows path variable settings on my machine, and download some weird stuff on Android Studio, which I'm not going to lie to you guys was a nightmare for me concerning that I'm on Windows. So I spent like a whole night doing that, and even in the React Native docs they say like, hey, setting up vanilla React Native is going to take like an hour, so they recommend using Expo, but I finally managed to get the stuff working. So the first thing that I realized is that vanilla React Native sometimes requires you to be touching native files. Like, I remember I had to edit the native Android folder several times and modify some random weird stuff on the build.gradle file just to get things going. So that definitely was a big disadvantage for me since I'm not an expert app developer. So in this experiment, I decided to not use the React Native Paper library, and instead I decided to design all the material UI components like the dialog using vanilla React Native as we're seeing right now on the code. I ran the test and I was surprised that the startup time was of only 1 second and 11 frames, and the app felt very smooth for me as you are seeing right now. Moreover, the app bundle size was of only 55.41 megabytes. I was impressed with these results and I decided to take a step even further by enabling Hermes. Hermes is basically a new React Native JavaScript engine which is more performant and generally makes app bundles smaller and improves the app startup time. So I followed the official React Native instructions to enable that, and as you're seeing right now, it turns out that the startup time with Hermes enabled and vanilla React Native was of only 1 second with 2 frames, and the app size was of 45.90 megabytes, which may not sound like that much of an improvement, but I think that is because our project is still very small. So I decided to add the React Native Paper library to the project, and I noticed that installing third-party libraries on vanilla React Native also had disadvantages. First of all, in order to install anything on vanilla React Native, I had to make a link, which is a way to communicate the libraries with the React Native code, which sometimes required some extra steps to install the library, which was hard for me since I am not an expert native developer. Second, I noticed that some of the vanilla React Native libraries, like for example the React Native Camera library, were needing maintainers, and people were planning to deprecate that in favor of the Expo camera, which I guess is more popular since these days most tutorials out there on YouTube are teaching Expo and not vanilla React Native, so packages may be a little bit more popular. I also noticed that the React Native Maps library was needing maintainers as well, which was weird because for some reason I kept seeing all these maintainers wanted announcements all over the place. So the process to install React Native paper library was a little bit harder for me because of the React Native link and all the extra instructions, but I think it worked well. This is the code I use for that, and if you know React, this is very familiar to you. Basically, it stores the to-do list inside a useTech function and it renders the items using a map function. As you're seeing right now, the startup time of the app was of 1 second and 26 frames, and the app felt very smooth. The app size was of only 57.67 megabytes, which is just a little bit greater in comparison with the previous experiment. Again, I decided to enable Hermes and I got a little bit of an improvement here since the startup time was of 1 second and 0 frames and the app size was of 47.16 megabytes. And as we can see, adding a third-party library to our project has very little impact on the app performance when enabling Hermes. Finally, I decided to use Expo. And for this, I have to say that Expo has a wider ecosystem of libraries like camera, microphone, video notifications, etc. So I think that an advantage of using Expo is that you get all these great tools that you may need in your app. So I decided to make the Expo app using React Native Paper, and as you are seeing right now, I was really surprised since the app startup time was of 3 seconds with 10 frames, and I couldn't believe that the app size was of 110 megabytes, which is like more of the double of the previous versions. I think that the reason for this is that I was using Expo with a managed workflow, which essentially increases the app size and loads a ton of stuff that I might not be really needing in my simple to-do app, which of course is harming the app performance. However, this setup enables people to easily build apps since with the managed workflow, developers do not have to worry about dealing with any native code, and the apps are compiled and built on Expo servers, so people are not required to install Xcode or Android Studio. So as far as I have seen, this is one of the most common ways people use to make a React Native app, and if you were to research on YouTube, most of the tutorials teach people to set up React Native using the Expo managed workflow. So I think this is a very common way in which people usually tend to build apps on React Native. However, as you have seen, this can have performance disadvantages sometimes. So I decided to try to enable the Hermes engine for Expo, but I found that at the time of recording this feature is only available under the EAS build plan, which is essentially a $29 premium subscription in which Expo provides you with servers to build your Expo app, and they enable you experimental features like Hermes, which was the only one that I needed. Luckily for me, I discovered that I was able to build the app with Hermes if I use the bare minimum Expo workflow, which essentially lets you compile with Hermes on your local machine. However, you need to set up and download Android Studio and Xcode to do that. So I had trouble setting this bare minimum workflow up since there aren't that many tutorials on the internet about this, but in the end I managed to get that going. Once I ran the Expo app with Hermes enabled and the bare minimum workflow, I was surprised that the startup time improved drastically to 1 second and 15 frames. And the app size reduced a lot to 47.9 megabytes, which is like a half of the previous one. So I definitely think it was worth it. As a comparison, right now you are seeing Flutter's and Native's startup times and app sizes, and it seems that Native still beats Flutter and React Native, since it takes less than a second to launch and the app size is simply the best. In addition, I think that most people these days are generally developing on Expo rather than on vanilla React Native, since most tutorials on YouTube are teaching Expo. So I think that more people need to realize that they may not need to use the fully managed Expo workflow, and that way they can improve their app performance. Moreover, I still think people will end up using Expo over vanilla React Native since it is easier to set up, and most of the apps these days require to use either the camera, notifications, or other native feature for which Expo can have a wider and more maintained set of libraries. So finally, I will say that if you are going to make a React Native app, consider building it locally instead of using the Expo managed workflow. However, building the app locally has a ton of disadvantages, since you have to deal with the native code. And also, you may not want to stop using Expo since it has a very active community and very nice and cool libraries. Moreover, I would recommend enabling Hermes anytime it is possible since it can give you a significant performance boost. And finally, I think that Expo, React Native, and Hermes are all three technologies that have trade-offs. And in the end, each of us have to decide the right tool for the job. So that's it, and thank you.